So we're perhaps inevitably slightly over time because we've had such rich offerings from everybody, but I suspect, do join, yes, please, otherwise we empty chair you literally. So I'm not going to explore this in quite the depth that I might have done previously, but there is something I'm confused about, and perhaps I'm the only one in the room, but your very interesting final section, they're both really interesting presentations, your very interesting final section about fixing the bugs and meta-morality.
Yeah.
I felt there was a slightly downhearted sense in you as you talked about that. Because although you were talking about the capacity to fix the bugs, you don't really believe it. Because fast thinking, no, I'm not saying you lack integrity, I'm simply saying that you're seeing of fast thinking and the tribe versus tribe kind of recourse to the obvious means it's very, very difficult to find ways of people to think more self-consciously and deliberatively about what will make a difference in that tribe-to-tribe conflict. But you, Michèle, have, particularly at the end and around AIDS, talked about social action and intervention that really did make a difference. So are you saying that the deliberative morality can work in a way that Joshua is a little bit sceptical about? Or are you just saying it depends? It depends on the subject. I mean, the most fascinating thing in a way is that the poor are always with us and we all like to hate them. And that's the bit of deliberative morality that never seems to work. So were you as downhearted about it as you slightly suggested?
You may have caught me on a bad day. I think it's a question really of just how impatient. I think if you look at the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I think there's something right about that, and I think the data back that up over the long term. I, like many of us, am less optimistic about the short term than I was, say, before last November, at least around here. But if you ask me, what are the long-term prospects for humanity? I think they're pretty good in the long run.
You are an American, so you would say that.
I would say that, but how long is the long term? I think is really the.
And when you
question.
talked about common currencies, what are the kinds of things in practical terms that you're talking about?
So I think that the thing that binds us together morally is the quality of our experience, our capacity for happiness, our capacity for suffering. If you start with anything that anyone values and ask them, why do you care about that? Why do you care about that? Why do you care about that? It's very hard to not eventually get to the quality of somebody's experience. So if you say, why'd you go to work today? Well, I like my job. I enjoy it. I also need to earn money. Why do you need money? Well, I need a place to live. Well, why can't you just sleep outside? And well, it gets cold. Well, what's wrong with cold? Well, it's painful. Well, what's wrong with pain? Well, it's just bad, right? And not saying every chain of value ends that way, but it's pretty hard to find one that doesn't, or at least partially end there. I think that is really our common moral currency. One philosophical approach is to say our ultimate goal should be to make life as happy as possible and reduce as much suffering for as many people as possible. And that's the philosophy that I subscribe to. But there are a lot of gut feelings about particular actions and particular policies and particular institutions and particular other people that get in the way of that. And depending on which side of the bed I woke up in the morning, I'm focused more on one or the other.
So the quality of life, Michèle, you talked about that in many different ways. But the interesting thing about your Israeli examples were the groups that were objectively stigmatized, but who appeared to have internalized it much less deeply than other groups. What do you think is going on there?
Well, they have access to national ideologies that treat them as insiders. And you mentioned the poor. I'll just mention quickly a book that I published in 2000 titled The Dignity of Working Man, which compares conceptions of we and them in France and the US, and which shows, at the time I did my interviews in 1993, the poor were very much embraced as us in France at the time, and the strong boundaries were drawn against Muslims as they are today. In the US, at the time I did the interviews, there were very strong moral boundaries drawn against blacks and the poor, thrown together, and much weaker boundaries drawn toward legal immigrants. So basically the patterns we have today were there then. And already then people were mentioning Trump as their moral hero. When I asked them, what people do you admire? In the US, Trump was very salient. The point here is to say that in this book...
Is that because he's rich?
Exactly.
Yes. Rich without earning it.
Because,
rich.
Then money becomes a symbol of morality. Yeah. But the argument of the book is that if in France there's weaker boundaries drawn toward blacks and the poor, at the time it was also because socialism, republicanism, and Catholicism remained extremely salient as cultural sources on which people could draw to make sense of the world. The first chapter was called The World in Moral Order, to understand how workers define the moral world. In the US, you don't have these cultural repertoires, which makes the poor particularly stigmatized.
But that's very confusing to someone who's not American, because I've never seen so many people go to church.
Yeah.
I mean, I once read a quote in The Economist that said that America is the most religious country after Iran, in terms of both believing and in attendance.
The definition...
So what's the difference there in terms of how...
Of altruism is a person-to-person. It's very different. And also poverty is not construed the same way in Protestantism as it is in Catholicism.
So that's a rather brief overview, but I suspect everyone is both a little bit tired, but also may have some questions for our excellent panelists. Can you tell us who you are?
My name is Helen. I'm from Saudi.
There's a microphone coming.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my name, it's working? Yeah. My name is Fadil Skate. I'm from Saudi Arabia. And my question is on the class system. Does it make a difference that the fact that there are multi-class system differs in terms of inclusion and exclusion? What I'm trying to say is that in some cultures, you don't have only one, i.e. black and white, but you have multiple levels of class. When you talked about the Israeli example, for example, the Arab Jew will be considered the lower class towards the other Jews. However, he's a superior class towards the Arab Muslims.
That's right.
Or the Arab Christians.
Well, sociologists make a distinction between gradations based on wealth and income. So you have a class system, and in addition, you have racial population that is distributed across this inequality. So in terms of, income, the Mizrahim were historically very much looked down at by the Ashkenazi Jew who created the Zionist state, and it's a group that has been very upwardly mobile and that is in the process of, marrying outside their group a lot. So there's a lot of evidence that confirms their view that they're becoming assimilated. Yet, if you look at the statistics, it remains clear that they're concentrated at the bottom half of the social structure when compared to Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah.
So all societies have these two dimensions.
I'm saying the fact that they accept they don't resent a lot is because they are in the middle, so they feel superior.
Yeah. Well, many people have argued that Israel is a country of it's a ethno-democracy, which puts its Jewish population above the others. It's the basis of the society. So.
You talked about a narrow sense of self, particularly about the grumpy Greeks, I think you said. And I just wondered where you thought that came from, because it was such a sort of, it reminded me of your notion, Michèle, of black communities and particularly saying, I'm going to confront whatever. There was a sort of slight sense that the only way you could energize your sense of us was through that, either grumpiness or overt kind of aggression.
Right. So there's been wonderful work on this, led by Joe Henrich, who's in our Human Evolutionary Biology department, and a wide group of collaborators on the question of what expands the sense of us. And they point to two related factors. So one is what they call market integration, which they sort of operationalize in terms of, this is when you're comparing small-scale societies to larger-scale societies. What % of your calories that you consume every day do you produce yourself versus get from other people? And then, of course, there could be other measures that would tell you how more deeply integrated into even a global market you are. And the other is being a member of a world religion, so like Judaism or Christianity or Buddhism, as opposed to a local religion. And what those two factors, they sound like different factors, but they're really the same thing, which is either in more imagined terms, who is your group and who's part of your cooperative group, and then literally economically, who do you depend on? Who do you trust that when you give the money over, you're getting real food instead of fake food, and that they're trusting that you're giving real money instead of fake money, metaphorically and literally. I think the answer based on this evidence, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is we trust the people that we cooperate with, from whom we have mutually beneficial interactions.
But it does take on, I mean, your point about Copenhagen and the trusting society. I was there earlier this year, or rather late last year, and I went to an opera, and everyone hung their coats up, because it's very chilly, on a coat peg, and left them there.
Yeah.
And when they came back, they were all there.
Right.
And it was completely, I mean, I think I live in a reasonably trusting society. I have never seen anything like this. I mean, it was just absolutely, it would have been so verboten to have anyone to have stolen any of those coats. And it wasn't about the fact it was a middle class thing. It was about their mutually trusting society. I mean, are the Scandis at the extreme of that from your work?
Well, I think they're at the extreme of it for a large society, right? So in a small village, people can leave their coats up, and it's because they know that other people are watching, and that it would be social death if anyone took somebody's coat, right? It's not worth the risk. In large cities, that's a much bigger problem. So the cooperative Scandinavians are at the extreme for being modern states that have small town levels of trust, right? And I remember having the same experience the first time I went to Tokyo, maybe 15 years ago, and seeing bikes unlocked all over the city. And I was just, so
counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because cities are also places where excluded groups can find a safe haven. I mean, certainly for the LGBT community, that's been true historically in the West.
Yeah, and in general, I would say that there's been a movement, at least in my discipline, to move away from talking about groups or societies as having uniform cultures.
Yes.
So, for instance, in the U.S., when Trump says, the blacks love me, everyone laughs because everyone knows that this is ridiculous, that there's a great deal of diversity, class diversities, and others among African Americans. So in general, there's been much more of a problematization of, for instance, notion of solidarity. Many people talk about Sweden as a society that has been historically extremely homogeneous, ethno-racially, So this high trust, what has been described as high trust, has also been achieved at the cost of a great level of homogeneity. So it's not essentialist, the idea that, Americans would be by nature generous and altruistic, or is really, the idea of, trying to understand how is the national identity constructed and what are the narratives on which we draw to come to understand ourselves as XYZ is another way of approaching it. And then when it comes to collaboration or cooperation, you look at, things such as labor market competition, how much there's intergroup contacts, there are conditions that foster greater collaborations or work against. So.
Any other questions from anybody? Gentleman over there. There's a microphone inching its way towards you from a person who's being squashed.
Yes, hi. This is Alan Karbach from Argentina. I was wondering whether the hope factor has something to do in this divergence and this struggle between different groups. I keep getting the feeling that more and more we are abandoning the societies are abandoning the possibility that members of the society can improve, their sons will be better off than they are, and whether that is creating a bridge within the individual tribes. And that the meta-morality is a farther goal because we have sort of had a involution in terms of our own societies, our own nations, countries, and we have grown in polarization because of that. And whether the fact that this hope is people become hopeless and therefore you become more polarized. I know we.
I don't know if that was for
No,
me,
go
but I
first,
think
Michèle.
that makes sense to me. I mean, and one of the big debates following the Trump's election is it about economic anxiety or is it about tribalism? I don't see those two things as separable, even though some people have argued, no, you can separate them out and it's one or it's the other. My understanding of how this works in our head is that when we have that sense of insecurity, that sense of I'm not doing as well as my parents and my children will do even worse than I am, we have a tendency to respond to that threat by tightening the group and saying, okay, enough of these outsiders, we have to take care of ourselves now, America first, coal country first, or whatever it is. And so I think that the sense of economic loss and the sense of decline and the real actual decline on the ground. Now, it's not just a sense. It leads some people to who have more tribalist kind of tendencies to begin with. Those become more extreme, whereas other people take it in a more, let's say, Bernie Sanders direction when they think that the system is not working. So I see an interaction between those two things. I think it's consistent with your observations.
Michèle?
Well, if you compare the reaction of African Americans and that of Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the latter group reacts avoiding conflict because there's no hope. That's what they tell us. They don't expect to be understood. African American, when you ask them to describe their experience, they're very upset that they're being misunderstood. For instance, middle class people who are presumed to be poor, that's extremely annoying. I think the conditions under which the Palestinian citizens of Israel live is such that they do not expect that any transformation is within their hands. They think that it's a matter for the international organizations to find a way out of the situation where they are. Whereas for the American, they constantly refer to the civil rights movement. The fact that the Constitution, the law, enables them to confront, and they know the great deal, and they mobilize the law all the time to their unions, through all kinds of mechanisms. So I think their capacity to confront is unparalleled across the five groups, because not only has those laws been passed, but also they are being enacted, and there are regulatory agencies that ensure that corporations, and you can get sued because you're not, you have discriminatory policies. So that's the huge difference. This hope is not springing from nowhere. There are social conditions that feed them.
Which are obviously quite difficult in huge global change economically, I think. Gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Chris Meyer. My company is called Nerve. And this is for Michèle. You made the remark a minute ago about Sweden having achieved less rivalry, tribalism, at the expense of diversity. And I wonder two things. First, we could think of the Scandinavian countries as homogeneous in certain reasonably superficial ways. We recognize a Scandinavian type, although, of course, it excludes the Samis who are throughout the region.
Of course.
So you showed us the explosion of papers on different definitions of what diversity means. We don't know that the Swedes are less sexually diverse or many of those dimensions. So the first question is it really true that Sweden, for example, is as much more homogeneous as we tend to think it is? And if you might admit a possibility that it isn't, what would you do with a hypothesis that diversity of income or economic diversity is actually more important than many of the other dimensions, and that might account for the relative harmony in Scandinavia?
Well, it always is on, as I'm sure you're aware, on any index of quality of life, Sweden is very high. And so, of course, it's a society, it's in a very abundant society, and a society, a social democratic society that uses, has a very, very high level of taxation, and it redistributes toward the poor a lot. And its corporatist model is based on collaboration across classes between the unions. And so the very fabric of the government is oriented towards sustaining solidarity. And its collective identity is very much anchored on the notion of humanitarianism. So therefore, it's a country that hosted the most Serbian refugees. So, you know, so it defines itself as a country of abundance that is also a country that welcomes outsiders. Canada does exactly the same thing, you know, with Trudeau getting, you know, being the most popular person now because he welcomes the Serbians by telling them you're home now. So, and those are also, of course, identities as highly advanced industrial societies that are defined very much in opposition to the US. So it's a spot, a cultural niche that is available to them, in part because the US defines itself as everything that is not that. But I think what I said about Scandinavia in general holds for Scandinavian societies. You know, Norway, which has this enormous wealth produced by oil, has also allowed a very low level of social conflicts. And it has, if you go to Oslo, there's very wide now, you know, neighborhoods with Muslim population. And there are tensions like there are everywhere in Europe, but they're managing them much better, in part because there's an index called the Keating-Kimlicka Index that ranks all societies based on how well they're doing in terms of multiculturalism. And this includes how much are they teaching English, well, in the US it's English as Spanish as a second language, all kinds of indicators of what the society does to integrate people. And there's research that shows that the higher the societies rank on this scale, the more their immigrants are engaging emotionally and cognitively with the host societies, and the more likely they are also to want to run for political office. So it's really a case of, you know, I think that's where the issue of what is done culturally and institutionally to integrate people matters a lot, because immigrants receive the message that the society depends on them to grow, you know, economically and otherwise. And it makes a very big difference because cultural membership is engineered. It's engineered by the state. And I think when, you know, Trump goes on and on with his language of exclusion toward everyone, it's just being extremely counterproductive because he's constantly telling all immigrants, you know, you're only allowed here if you know, if you make a lot of money, otherwise we're not interested in having you here. So, you know.
Do you want to add to that?
Oh.
We're going to wind up in 2 minutes, but I just want to ask a personal question, which is, do you ever, when you think about tribes and diversity, think of neurodiversity? The kind of boys in Silicon Valley who are developing technologies and an entire world that the rest of us in the West, at least, live in, and yet actually seem utterly divorced from an awful lot of tribal loyalties as we have understood them and talked about them tonight. And that may be because they are neurologically diverse. They're on their brains are brilliant, but they actually don't connect in the way that you've talked about connection. Do we ever look at that?
I mean, there's certainly, it's not something I've ever done research on, and you know, there's a increasing awareness of, you know, neurodiversity and around autism and the autism spectrum in particular. I think that, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's a different kind of diversity.
Exactly.
Right?
But it may be a very important
and I think
one.
it's in some ways it's similar to, you know, people often ask why did marriage equality and other gay rights issues happen so quickly, and it's still taking so much longer when it comes to race and things like that. And I think it's because, and other people have said as well, that, you know, you can have a gay person born into your family, into the middle of your tribe, whereas a white family doesn't just suddenly have a black baby, right? Or a baby who turns black or becomes apparent that the baby is black when they're 12, right? And so there are whatever differences that people may have in the way that they think, they still have friends, they still have family members who are part of the rest of the way of seeing the world. And so I think that difference is not going to function in the same way, if it's real and it matters, the way traditional sort of tribal differences do. But the more that there is a kind of culture that allows for a kind of social detachment, then it can kind of take on a life of its own. But I see very positive things coming out of Silicon Valley as well. I mean, I think it's easy to demonize them as that culture has sort of risen enormously because of just the enormous profits that companies like Google and Facebook. I mean, but I think I have to hand it to them. I think they've done a lot of good.
Of course,
Yeah.
all technology is double-edged and really morally neutral. It's the social distance, I think, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And on that perfectly self-indulgent note, I'm going to thank both of you very much. Can we show our appreciation, please?
Thank you.